So this is a video of our process for laying pavers. Our first step is excavate and remove the sod. Once we have excavated enough to be able to get a good 4 to 6 inches of base, we begin to put our base. The material that we use for base is crushed concrete, and we want to put a good 4 to 6 inches of crushed concrete, depending on the application. And we want to get as level as possible before compacting it. So we rake it out, get it level, make sure that everything's draining and sloping toward the right direction. Make sure there's no humps or valleys in it. You want it nice and straight. And then we compact it with a plate compactor. We want to make a good 2 to 3 passes with a plate compactor to get everything nice and compacted, and it'll end up with a nice solid base under the pavers once we're done.
So whenever we're dumping the sand, it doesn't take very much sand, so a couple things. Make sure that the front of the wheelbarrow doesn't dig into the crushed concrete a whole lot, because then it just makes it hard to level it out. And then you want to just do small piles, because if you dump too much, it just makes it a little more difficult to spread around. So we just dump that in small piles, and then whenever we're raking it and smoothing it out, you want to be careful with the rake. Try not to let it dig into the crushed concrete, because then it pulls the rocks up to the surface, and then you got to pick those out by hand. And it's usually good to start off, for example, on this edge right here, and then we'll bring a paver back here and actually use the paver. We'll set it on top of the sand, and so we can see how much sand we need before we rake it all, because you don't want to rake it all and then have to take some away because there's too much sand. So once the sand is all spread with the rakes, as good as you can get it, we'll use these trials. And it's important that we use this type of trowel. It's a magnesium trowel, and it has a beveled or curved edge here. And that way, if you try to use a regular concrete trowel, it kind of tends to dig into the sand, and it's more difficult to use. So these are a lot easier to use. And then you just take, it's best, if you start from one side and work your way out. That way you're not stepping on top of areas that you've already smoothed out. And whichever direction you're doing it, you want to pick up the opposite edge. So I want to angle it just slightly like this if I'm pushing the sand this way, and then I want to angle it the other direction if I'm pulling the sand the other way. And this is the most important part for getting the right level and grade of the pavers. I want to make sure that it's all draining correctly, and that there's no dips or humps anywhere in the pavers. It all has to be nice and smooth. Otherwise, once you lay your pavers in there, you're gonna be able to notice the inconsistencies.
Another actually important thing to remember for anyone that's bringing the pavers and unloading them off the trailer is, for example, if we're using from more than one pallet, most of the time we are. In this case, we had 2 pallets. Whenever they stack the pavers on the pallets, they always put an even amount of each size on each layer. And these are, that's 1 layer, 2 layer, 3 layers. That's what we call layers. And since these pavers actually have a pattern, there's 3 different sizes. The way they stack the pallets evenly. So whenever we start bringing the pavers back to where we're laying them, it's always important to take 1 layer at a time. And usually 1 layer is about 1 wheelbarrow full, unless we're using the muck trucks, and we can fit more. So we want to take 1 layer at a time, but we also want to alternate pallets. That way we get a good mixture of colors. For example, you can see like that layer on this pallet has lighter colors and this one has darker colors. So instead of taking all from one pallet and then going to the next pallet and taking from it, we want to take 1 layer from this pallet and 1 layer from this pallet and alternate back and forth. And that way that we get a good mixture of colors. And the problem, what happens is, if somebody's laying the pavers and they think, oh, I'm running out of small ones, and they tell whoever's bringing them, hey, bring me more small pavers. Well, they'll start bringing all the small pavers out of 1 pallet, and then when we get to the end, there's no more small pavers. But the issue was the person that was laying them was laying too many small ones. They should have been laying less small pavers. So, to solve that problem, that's pretty much the rule. Whoever's carrying the pavers back there, 1 layer at a time, alternating pallets.
The tools you're going to need to have with you are a rubber mallet and one of these trowels, just to touch up areas if it needs it before you lay the pavers down. But for the most part, you want to have everything, or at least a good area in front of you, already leveled and ready to go. That way you can just start laying pavers and you don't have to stop. And then you also want to have some pavers close by that you can reach without having to stand up and walk back and forth. Normally we'll have somebody bringing pavers to you while somebody's laying pavers. And if we're not able to get the pallets close by, especially. In some cases, the pavers have a pattern that you follow. And so it's just as simple as following that pattern while you're laying them. It might take a little bit to learn the pattern. But in this case, these are called Plaza Freestone Combo. It comes with a large rectangle, a square, and a small rectangle. And they go in randomly. There's no specific pattern that you have to follow. The only thing that you do need to make sure of is that you're using an equal amount of each size paver. You don't want to end up using way too many of the square ones and then run out at the end. Because if you run out, then you're going to have one whole section that doesn't have any square ones or as much square ones as the rest of it had. And then it doesn't look as good. So that's the main thing you want to pay attention to with the random pattern pavers. And then, sometimes it's easy to overthink it when you're doing the random. Excuse the chickens. So, try not to overthink it. It really is random. You don't have to just have as long as whoever's bringing you the pavers, they should always bring an even amount of each size and stack them in even size stacks. That way, if you just start randomly grabbing them, it's already going to be mixed, a good mix of the sizes. If they bring you a bunch of one size, then you're going to have a tendency to use more of that size. So you shouldn't have to think about that part too much. The other thing you want to make sure of when you're laying the pavers is that you can see how, you might not be able to see because there's so many pavers in the way, but as you're laying the pavers, you create lines where the pavers meet up, and you don't want those lines to end up too long. So for example, in this case, there's a line that starts back here, and it's going to end up going all the way at least to here right now. It can go a little longer, that would be okay, but I'll go ahead and break that line up. So I'll start laying my pavers in there randomly, and I know that I want to stop that line right here. So I don't want to lay a paver that goes past that point. I'll go ahead and lay one, for example, a square one, and then to be able to break that line, I'll lay one that goes across it. So now that line stops right there. If you have lines that go like the whole length of a patio or a walkway, it causes the walkway to be less, it's not as strong, it makes a weak point, and it doesn't look as good either. So that's why we want to make sure we don't let those lines go too long. When we actually lay the pavers, you never want to set the paver down in the sand and then push it up against, in the corner where it needs to go, or up against the other pavers, because when you do that, it'll cause the sand on the bottom to get shoved up in between the pavers, and they won't butt up against each other flush. And the more you do that, it'll just cause the pattern to eventually be off and the pavers to get out of square. So the way we do it to avoid that is, before you set it all the way down, you butt it up against the corner where it needs to go, and then let it set down on top of the sand. And then once it's sitting on the sand, you don't move it anymore. It's there. So another, I guess, kind of a mistake that I see people make, the reason we keep a mallet with us is to kind of help square up the pavers if we need to. For example, if they're not quite lining up, or one's not quite fitting in that spot, you can bump the pavers in either direction, and that'll help it fit better. And then also, sometimes if you see one paver, you set it down and it's a little uneven, you can tap one side of it and that'll help it sit down evenly. But you don't want to do that too much, because if you hammer or tap every single paver that you set in there, whenever you tap it down, it compresses it down into the sand and makes it so if I tap this one down, if I just sat there and tapped it a few times and it compressed it down, when I go to lay the next paver, it's going to sit up a little bit higher than that one, and that's going to force me to have to hit that one down too, and it'll force me to have to do it to the next one, and eventually you're having to do that to every single paver, and you might even have to take the sand and pull it away so that they're all even again. So that's the reason you don't want to tap every single paver with the hammer. It's really not necessary. So don't overthink that part. If you see some slight unevenness, just keep going. We can come back later and kind of double check and see if there's any ones that are bad enough to worry about, and we'll go back and tap those ones down after we're done laying the pavers. So the way I do it whenever we have the random pattern is I just start laying. I usually kind of alternate the sizes that I'm grabbing, and I might lay one or two square ones, and then a small rectangle, and another square, and then a big one, and I'll alternate the direction that I'm laying them. And you can see I'm going pretty quick here. I'm not looking back and thinking about it too much, because if I do that, it's going to slow me down a lot. And then after I lay a good section of them, I'll take a pause and I'll look back and see if there's any lines that I need to break up. So I'm not looking at that for every single paver that I lay. I just periodically look back and make sure that I'm not making one line too long. And if there is, then I'll work towards breaking that line up and then move on. So for example, I can see right here, you might not be able to see in the video, but I've got two lines going that start from back here all the way to where I'm stopped laying pavers there. And there's another one that's back here all the way to where I stopped laying the pavers. So I want to try and put a paver that covers that line so that it doesn't continue on all the way to the end. So I guess while I'm talking about that, the other thing that you want to make sure of when we lay pavers is you always want to keep the pavers stair-stepped. You can see kind of how, like down there, I came out farther, and there's kind of a stair-step down right here, a stair-step down, stair-step, 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 all the way down to that point. If I worked ahead of myself on that side and start closing it in, what can happen is I end up having to fit pavers into a space, a certain space. It doesn't give me an open area to work out towards. So for an example, I don't want to start laying pavers out here coming out this way. See, right there, I'm already closing myself in. Now I have to fill in this gap from paver to paver. And if they're slightly crooked or slightly off, then I'm going to have to start hammering them with the mallet and moving them around and have to like jam them in there, and it causes you to take a lot more time. So I don't want to do that. Instead, I would continue working my way from down there back towards this direction and keep it stair-step. You can see it actually started happening over here already in this section. I also don't want to continue working this direction and have to close it and fill in the gap right here. So to prevent that from happening, I want to create a new stair-stepped area right here. So I will go ahead and fill in. This is a gap right here that I need to fill in. So I'll do that. See, look, I'm having to fit the pavers between each other, and I had to kind of wiggle it around to get it to go in. So there. Now everything is, well, except for this paver, that probably shouldn't be there either. Everything is stair-stepped, and I can continue to work my way that direction. See, this is an example of one that you probably won't see it on the video, but this paver is sticking out a little bit farther than this paver. And so I'll just tap that a few times to where it's even. That way, whenever I lay another paver there, it will sit square and it won't be crooked or cockeyed a little bit. So this is where I got to the point where I want to break up this line. Starts back here, goes all the way to here. That's about as long of a line as I want to get. And so to do that, I'm going to have to lay a small paver here so that it's even right here. And then once I start working my way back this direction, I'll make sure that I lay a paver that sits over the top of that line. So I messed up right here. This was also one of the lines that I wanted to break up, and I actually laid this paver to where that line was going to continue. So since I noticed that, and it's not going to take much to fix it, I just take up those two pavers, move that one back, and now that line stops right there. And then I'll continue on. This is another line. I'll make sure that that one gets broken up.
So before we start doing our concrete border, like you can see we started there, we always come through and pull the sand away. So you've got the base and the layer of sand on top of the base. You always want to pull the sand away from where the edge of the pavers ended up to where we're going to be putting our concrete. We usually put about 3 to 4 inches wide of a concrete curb. So we want that 3 to 4 inches not to have any sand underneath the concrete. So we pull all that away, like you can see they started doing here. Make sure we have sufficient space for that concrete border. That way, because if we lay our concrete on top of the sand can just wash out from underneath the concrete and cause it to break and not be as strong. But once we lay that concrete directly on top of the base, it makes it a lot stronger and it'll last forever that way. When we start putting our concrete, we have it pre-mixed in a wheelbarrow. We usually get it, we don't want to mix it too wet because it makes it hard to form. So on the dry side, not too dry either. And then we work ahead of ourselves a little ways, just laying however much concrete we're going to need in there with a shovel. Once you've done it a little bit, you kind of get an idea of how much you're going to need, because you don't really want to put too much or too little, because then you got to either move it or put more. Once we've got a section of it done, we go ahead and come back with our trowel and start shaping the concrete, smoothing it out. So whenever we do our concrete border, we always bring the concrete to about halfway or 3/4 of the way up the side of the paver, so that it has enough, it grabs enough of the pavers to hold it in. But we don't want to go all the way to the top, because if we leave a little space, that gives us enough room to come back and cover the concrete with some dirt or topsoil and put sod on top of that, or grass can grow back on top of the dirt then. That way, in the end, you won't even see the concrete. All you'll see is the walkway, because the concrete edge is kind of the ugly part. You don't really want to have to look at that. Every now and then there might be a situation where you're not able to cover it up. It doesn't happen that often. Usually you can do something to cover it up, but if you're not able to cover it up, we'll make sure we do a really good job at smoothing it out and making it look really neat and pretty. But if we know we're going to be able to cover it up, it doesn't have to look perfect when we smooth it out. We just want it to come up, like I said, 3/4 of the way or halfway up the side of the pavers, and then it slopes away from the pavers. And that creates kind of a curb which holds all the pavers in place. So after we're done with the concrete border, the last step that I didn't get in the video is that we sweep sand into the cracks of the pavers. We just spread a very thin layer of sand across the top, and you work your way from one side to the other, sweeping it in with a broom. It's not necessary that the sand fills up the cracks from the bottom to the top, but we want to make sure that all of the cracks of the pavers get sand in them. That helps lock them into place and stay more sturdy.